Lesson 3.1 Renting an Apartment. A landlord is a person who rents out an apartment, townhouse, house, etc. A tenant is a person who agrees to rent the apartment from the landlord. When the landlord rents to somebody, the landlord gives tenancy. So tenancy means you have a legal right to occupy the rental, so you're legally allowed to live there. The landlord and tenant have a tenancy agreement, which may or may not be in writing. If the tenancy agreement is in writing, it's called a lease. A lease is for a specific time period where the beginning and end dates are set out beforehand. In other words, the tenancy agreement is for a fixed term of time. So that term of time might be a yearly lease, which means the tenancy will last 1 year. A monthly lease, the tenancy has no agreed fixed term, and the tenant may leave at the end of any month. Or a specified term. The landlord and the tenant decide an agreed upon start and end date. There are other types of leases. You might have a weekly lease or a bi-weekly lease, but these three are the most common. Now, what that means is not that you have to leave at the end of 1 year or 1 month or at the end of the specified term, but that means the lease is up for renewal. So if you have a yearly lease, at the end of the year, the landlord and the tenant would meet and decide whether or not the lease will continue or the tenant will move out. A security deposit. A landlord may request that a tenant pay a security deposit at the beginning of tenancy. The security deposit is intended to compensate a landlord for damage the tenant does to a suite beyond normal wear and tear, any unpaid rent or bills, and the cost to the landlord if the tenant vacates or leaves without proper notice. A security deposit cannot be more than 1/2 a month's rent, and the landlord cannot ask for an extra deposit if the rent is increased. At the end of a tenancy, a landlord must return a tenant's security deposit with interest minus any deductions. So deductions would be anything from the list above that the landlord needed to spend. So an example would be Ron is renting an apartment for $800 a month. He is charged the maximum security deposit allowed. How much is his deposit? So remember it said on the page before that security deposit cannot be any more than 1/2 a month's rent. So if he's being charged the maximum deposit, it would be 1/2 of that rent. So we would just do 800 divided by 2. His deposit would be $400. So rent. Rent is the amount of money a tenant pays to the landlord in order to stay on the property. The amount of the rent and how often it's paid is predetermined and outlined in the lease. So for example, determine how much each person is paying in rent per year. So some people pay rent monthly. So in this example, this person is paying $825 per month. So what are they paying in a year? Well, there's 12 months in a year, so we just multiply by 12, and we see that they're paying $9,900. Some people pay rent weekly. So this person's paying $190 per week. Since there's 52 weeks in a year, we see that they pay $9,880. And some people pay rent bi-weekly. So this person pays $400 bi-weekly, which means every 2 weeks. So we would do 400 times 20, or 26, because there's 52 weeks in a year. So if you pay bi-weekly, you would pay 26 times. And this person would pay $10,400 in rent in the year. In Nova Scotia, landlords are only allowed to increase the rent once in a 12-month period, and only when the lease is up for renewal. So at the end of a lease, if you're deciding that you're staying, a landlord may decide to increase the rent, but he can only do so once in a 12-month period. And they have to give you ample notice so that you can decide if the rent is going up too much, whether you want to leave the apartment or not. And subletting or assigning a lease. If you plan to leave for a period of time and then return, you can choose to sublet the unit to someone else. This means although your name is on the lease and you will be returning, someone else is living there for the time being. If you don't want to continue with the lease, you don't plan on returning, you can ask the landlord for permission to assign any months remaining on the lease to a new person. So for example, if you have a 1-year lease and you've been there for 6 months, you might ask the landlord if someone else could take over the remaining 6 months of your lease. The new person is then responsible for the lease and paying rent until the lease ends. So when you're subletting, the lease is still in your name and you're responsible for the apartment, but when you're signing the lease, you're no longer responsible for the apartment. A landlord needs to give you permission to sublet the unit or have someone else take over the lease, but your landlord has the right to refuse a prospective tenant from subletting or having the lease assigned to them. For example, if they have no reference or a bad credit rating. So that's it. That's lesson 3.1 on renting an apartment. There are a few activities posted on the website that you can try to learn more about the ins and outs of renting an apartment.